Wine and moonlight spilled across the marble floor simultaneously, and for one breathless second, Elara could not tell which one looked colder. The wine was dark red, almost black in the silver light pouring through the palace's high windows. It spread in a slow, ugly pool around her knees, soaking into the hem of her plain dress, crawling between her fingers as she pressed her palms against the stone to catch herself. The moonlight did not move. It simply watched. So did the court. 300 wolves filled the great hall of Dravenhall. Alpha lords from the mountain territories. Silver-robed merchants from the river cities. Foreign dignitaries and military commanders and noble women glittering beneath enough jewels to fund a small war. All of them had gathered for the Grand Moon Festival, the most sacred night of the year, the night the Alpha King renewed his bond with the ancient throne before every assembled bloodline in the kingdom. The night when servants were expected to disappear. Elara had almost managed it. She had kept her head down all evening, moving between the long tables with a wine pitcher clutched in both hands, pouring when cups emptied and stepping back when nobles grew too loud. She had been practicing invisibility since she was 14, and she was good at it. But Lady Selira Voss had never allowed Elara the mercy of disappearing. Selira occupied the carved silver seat reserved for royal consorts as though it had been designed specifically for her. Not the throne itself, not yet, but close enough that every wolf in the room understood what she wanted. Her golden gown pooled around her like melted sunlight. Moonstone earrings brushed her collarbone. A crown-shaped comb glittered in her dark hair. Around her throat rested a necklace of pale blue diamonds, the kind that kingdom law reserved for queens during sacred ceremonies. No priest had corrected her. No council elder had spoken. Not even Alpha King Darius Valen, who sat on the ancient throne with one hand resting on the wolf-carved arm, watching his festival with the distant expression of a man who had conquered too much to be moved by ceremony. It was Selira who noticed Elara approaching with the wine pitcher. She always noticed. The moment Elara came within range, Selira's smile changed. Not wider, sharper. The difference between a smile and a blade was purely a question of intent, and Selira's intent had never required much interpretation. Elara. Her voice arrived perfectly sweet. Come closer. Every instinct Elara possessed told her to stop walking. The silver handle of the pitcher bit into her palm as her fingers tightened around it. The metal was cold, unreasonably cold, as though warning her. But refusal was not available to a servant girl with no family name and no protection beyond the mercy of people who had never shown her much. Yes, my lady. Selira lifted her empty goblet without looking at it. Pour. Elara lowered her gaze and carefully tilted the pitcher. She kept her wrist steady. She kept her breathing shallow. She could smell Selira's perfume from where she stood, crushed roses drowned in honey, expensive enough to hide rot. The wine ran smoothly into the goblet. A few nearby nobles had already turned to watch, the way people turn when they sense something entertaining is about to happen to someone who cannot afford to fight back. She finished pouring and began stepping away. That was when Selira moved. It was almost nothing. The smallest extension of one silk-covered foot. A trap placed with the patience of someone who had said it many times before, in many rooms, against many people who were slower to understand the game. Elara's ankle caught. The world lurched. The pitcher left her hands. For one terrible, suspended second it turned in the air, flashing silver beneath the chandeliers. Then it struck the marble with a crack that split through the hall like a fault line, and wine exploded outward across Elara's dress, the white stone, and the edge of Selira's golden gown. The laughter came before she even finished falling. Sharp, cruel, relieved, the particular relief of a crowd that has been waiting for someone beneath them to fail so they can feel safely above it. Elara hit the floor hard, palms skidding through the spreading stain. Pain shot through her knees. Her breath locked behind her ribs. She stared down at the dark liquid soaking into her hands, and for one dizzy moment, it looked exactly like blood. Selira gasped, not because she was shocked, because she wanted every eye in the hall looking at precisely the right place. My gown, she breathed. The laughter softened into murmurs. The murmurs were worse. I am sorry, my lady, Elara said quickly, head lowered. I slipped. I will clean it immediately. Selira rose slowly. The movement made the diamonds at her throat catch the light and scatter it across the ceiling. She stepped closer until her golden slippers were inches from Elara's fingers. You slipped. The words carried. They always carried when Selira wanted witnesses. Elara did not answer. Look at me, Selira said. Elara lifted her head. Selira stared down at her with an expression so composed it was almost beautiful. Then the smile came again. That particular, unhurried smile of someone who has all the time in the world and every advantage in the room. Lower, she said softly. And she pointed to the floor. A servant rushed forward with cloths. Selira raised one hand. The servant stopped as though she had walked into a wall. No cloth, Selira said. She made the mess with her clumsy hands. Let her clean it with them. The hall held still for half a breath. Then someone laughed. That was all it ever took. The laughter spread from table to table, gathering momentum, rolling across the room with the ugly momentum of things that feed on cruelty. Heat crawled up the back of Elara's neck. Her hands trembled, but she did not cry. She absolutely would not give them that. Slowly, she lowered her eyes to the marble and pressed her palms flat against the cold, wine-soaked stone. The liquid moved beneath her nails. It stained the lines of her hands the color of shame she had not earned. Selira crouched beside her, close enough that only Elara could hear clearly, far enough that the words could still reach the nearest tables if anyone was listening carefully. Be grateful, Selira said. Girls like you should be kissing stone floors, not looking at thrones. The court laughed louder. Someone struck a goblet against a table in something like approval. Elara kept her head down. She stared at the wine. She stared at the marble. She stared at anything except the throne rising behind Selira, the ancient seat of black moonstone veined with silver, older than the palace itself, older than the current bloodline, older than every law that had ever told her where she was allowed to look. She had polished its steps every 7th morning since she was 14, and every time her fingers brushed the lowest carving, she felt the same impossible, embarrassing thing. A pulse. Faint. Buried. Waiting. She had never told anyone. She had barely admitted it to herself. Perhaps you should thank me, Selira said, still crouching, still close, for reminding you where you belong. The words landed harder than the fall had. Elara pulled her hands back from the wine. Her fingers were stained red. Her dress was ruined. Her knees ached. And her pride burned somewhere deep enough that no one in the room could reach it, which was the only place left that still belonged entirely to her. She should have lowered her head. She should have apologized. She should have disappeared into the kitchens and let the night close over her. Instead, she looked up, not at Selira, at the throne. The laughter died in her ears. The chandeliers seemed to dim. The moonlight sharpened. And from somewhere beneath the marble, a sound moved through the stone under her knees. Not a crack, not a groan. Something older than either of those things. A heartbeat. Elara froze. Selira's smile faltered. What are you staring at? Elara tried to answer. She genuinely did. But before any word left her mouth, the ancient throne began to glow. A thin silver line appeared first, running along the carved wolves at the base. Then another. Then another. The forgotten symbols buried in the black stone awakened one by one, burning with cold moonfire that had no source anyone could name. Light crawled up the throne's spine like blood returning to something long believed dead. The Alpha King rose from his seat. The room stopped breathing. Selira stumbled back from the steps. What is this? No one answered. The priests near the altar dropped to their knees. The royal guards drew their swords, though none of them seemed certain who the blades were meant for. The glow intensified, spilled down the throne steps, crossed the marble floor, straight through the wine, straight toward the servant girl still kneeling at the center of the room. Elara tried to move. Her body would not obey. The silver light touched her stained fingers. Every torch in the great hall went dark. Then the throne released something, not sound, not light, but pure, ancient force, that slammed through the chamber so violently that goblets shattered and banners tore from the walls, and every wolf-blooded soul in the room bent against their will. Every noble, every general, every visiting dignitary, every alpha lord who had spent a lifetime certain of their position in the natural order of things. Even King Darius Valen dropped to one knee. Only Elara remained upright, still kneeling in spilled wine, still wearing her plain servant's dress, still shaking badly enough that she could barely draw breath. The silver symbols rose from the throne like living fire and wound themselves around her wrist. The oldest priest lifted his head. His face had gone the color of old parchment. "No," he breathed. Selira spun toward him. "What does it mean?" The priest stared at Elara as though looking at something he had spent his entire life hoping he would never see. The ancient throne answered before he could find words. A beam of silver light struck the crown above the seat and split across the hall, illuminating every carved wolf, every kneeling noble, every stunned and terrified face in the room. At the center of it all, Elara, the servant girl, the girl they had laughed at, still covered in wine, hands still stained red. "Chosen." Selira backed away, shaking her head. "No, that is impossible." Elara looked down at her glowing hands. She did not feel powerful. She did not feel chosen. She felt like the floor had dissolved beneath her, and something ancient had opened its eyes in the dark beneath the world. Then every door in the great hall slammed shut simultaneously. The laughter was gone. The music was gone. The court was silent in a way courts never were. Not the practiced silence of people performing deference, but the stunned silence of people who had just watched the world change and didn't yet understand what it had changed into. Every eye turned to the servant girl kneeling before the ancient throne. Because on the most sacred night in the kingdom's calendar, in front of every noble bloodline, every visiting dignitary, every man and woman who had ever decided Elara's place for her, the throne had ignored the king. It had ignored his mistress. It had ignored the carefully arranged hierarchy of 300 people. It had answered only her. The silence did not survive the night. Silence never survived inside royal courts, especially not when fear had entered the room and sat down at every table. The moment the silver light faded from the throne, whispers exploded through the great hall like sparks finding dry grass. Nobles leaned into each other's ears. Priests exchanged looks across the altar. Military commanders muttered beneath their breath. Some faces held fear. Others held fury. Most held the specific, bewildered expression of people who have been absolutely certain of how the world worked and have just been informed they were wrong. Not one of them looked at Elara the same way they had 10 minutes earlier. That frightened her more than the throne itself. The silver symbols had vanished from her wrist. The throne had returned to its silent black state. The torches burned again. The musicians had cautiously resumed, playing something quiet and uncertain. Yet the air in the hall had fundamentally changed, the way air changes after lightning, even when the sky has gone clear again. Something had happened that could not be unhappened. The Alpha King descended the throne steps first. At 34, Darius Vallon had ruled for nearly a decade and looked every year of it. Not in the soft way of men who governed from comfort, but in the harder way of someone who had spent those years actually ruling. Tall, broad-shouldered, scarred along the jaw. His face carried none of the polished pleasantness favored by noble courts. Only discipline. Only the controlled exhaustion of a man who had spent years surrounded by ambitious wolves wearing human faces and grown very tired of pretending not to notice. He moved through the parting crowd and stopped before Elara. He studied her the way a general examines a battlefield after discovering something unexpected buried beneath the ground. Not as a man looks at a woman, not even as a king looks at a subject. He was trying to understand what he was seeing and why it already felt important. "What is your name?" The question rang through the hall as though he had given it weight deliberately. "Elara, your majesty." "Family name." The silence that followed that question was different from all the others. Heavier, more pointed. "I don't have one." A ripple moved through the crowd. No family, no house, no bloodline, no claim to anything. Nothing at all. Darius's expression did not change. "How long have you served in the palace?" "Since I was 14, your majesty." The calculation behind his eyes ran quick and quiet. Then, "My king." The interruption arrived with the particular smoothness of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment and had chosen it perfectly. Lord Varric Thorn stepped forward from the assembled nobles. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed, the kind of man who looked so trustworthy that nobody trusted him, which was exactly why he had accumulated more real power than most men twice his presence. He controlled trade routes, tax collection, military appointments, noble patronage. If Darius governed the kingdom publicly, Varric controlled the invisible architecture beneath it. "My king." He offered a slight bow. The throne clearly experienced a disturbance of some kind. "Perhaps we should avoid alarming our guests unnecessarily." A pause shaped with precision. Not a miracle. Not a sign. Not a prophecy. A disturbance. Darius looked at him. The two men held that look for several seconds. A whole conversation compressed into silence, and then the king nodded once. Continue the festival. The room exhaled collectively. The miracle became an inconvenience. The court wanted normalcy desperately, and Varric had offered it to them, and they accepted it with the speed of people relieved to be given permission not to think. Music swelled. Wine moved. Conversations restarted. Only Lady Selira Voss did not relax. She watched Elara from across the hall with an expression that had replaced its usual composure with something rawer and less flattering. Fear. Only for a moment. Only one. Then it vanished beneath anger, because anger was more useful than fear, and Selira had spent her life being practical. By midnight, the punishment had arrived. Not publicly. Public punishment risked generating the one thing Selira could least afford, sympathy. Instead, Elara was summoned to the lower kitchens through a servant message that offered no explanation. She descended through the palace's underground levels, past storerooms and laundry chambers, into the deep, honest smell of the place where she had actually lived for years: boiled vegetables, burned grease, wet stone, exhaustion. The kitchen mistress stood waiting with her arms crossed. Do you understand what you've done? Elara blinked. No, neither do I, the woman said, with the flat resignation of someone who had stopped expecting palace politics to make sense. But apparently you've managed to embarrass half the court by falling down. I embarrassed them by. Welcome to palace life, girl. By sunrise, Elara had been assigned 3 weeks of additional labor. Her archive duties suspended. Her sleeping quarters moved. Her meal rations reduced. No explanation. No investigation. No inquiry into how a servant girl had managed to make the ancient throne glow during the most observed ceremony of the year. Only punishment. Because powerful people feared mysteries more than injustice. And Elara had become the most inconvenient mystery in the kingdom. Deep beneath the palace, Elder Rowan lit his lantern well past midnight and opened a cabinet that had not been unlocked in decades. He had spent 40 years in service to the historical record. He knew the difference between information that had been lost and information that had been deliberately removed. And as he compared one document to another, then to records pulled from 3 different archive boxes, the pattern became unmistakable. Someone had been erasing things, not carelessly, but systematically, across multiple royal reigns. The same names, the same bloodline, removed again and again, as though the sheer repetition could make the original existence impossible to imagine. Most of the names had faded beyond reading. One had been scratched out so violently the parchment had nearly torn. Then Rowan found the symbol in the margin. The same symbol that had appeared around Elara's wrist. The same one burning on the throne. He went very still, because the truth now forming was not the kind that left room for comfortable uncertainty. Someone had spent generations ensuring an entire bloodline remained exactly where Selira had wanted Elara, on the floor, looking at nothing. The question was not whether Elara was connected to what the throne had recognized. The question was whether one thread had survived by accident, hidden in the palace kitchens for years. Rowan looked at his lamp flame. Then he began pulling more records from the shelves. The kingdom tried to forget. That was the strange thing about powerful institutions. When confronted with mysteries they could not contain, they rarely searched for answers. They buried the questions and called it order. The Grand Moon Festival ended. Nobles returned to their estates. The court resumed its cycle of meetings and feasts and carefully managed alliances. Outwardly, everything appeared normal. But Elara felt it changed the moment she stepped into the palace courtyard 3 days later, carrying a basket of firewood. The royal hunting hounds, 12 massive creatures bred from generations of wolf blood, trained to obey only their specific handlers, stopped moving all at once. Every one of them. Their ears lifted. Their heads turned. Then, one by one, with the slow deliberateness of a choreography no one had written, they moved toward her. Not aggressively. Not with the excited chaos of animals approaching food. With something that had no name in any language Elara knew. The largest among them, a scarred gray beast named Brutus, lowered himself onto his front legs and bowed his head. The others followed. The kennel master dropped a leash in the dirt. Elara's firewood basket hit the ground. Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time. Then the hounds stood and walked away. The story spread through the palace before the sun set. By morning it had crossed into the capital. By weeks it had reached outlying provinces. And it wasn't alone for long. Ancient relics activated in her presence. A sacred silver medallion in the Hall of Ancestors, dormant for 3 generations, began glowing when she passed beneath it. The priest called it coincidence. The second relic called it something harder to dismiss. A sealed temple door that had not opened in 80 years swung inward the moment she touched its frame. Sacred flames burned brighter. Old prayer bells rang without wind. And a nearly 90-year-old guardian at the Moon Temple, blind, frail, someone who had not genuflected voluntarily in decades, dropped to both knees the instant Elara entered the courtyard, his hands shaking, his voice cracking with something that sounded less like reverence than recognition. The blood remembers. Nobody understood what it meant. But by the following week, half the kingdom was repeating it. The other half was trying very hard not to. Selira understood the danger before almost anyone else. Attention was the currency of her world, and watching it shift, slowly, almost invisibly, away from her and toward a servant girl was an experience she found increasingly difficult to contain. She dismissed the incidents publicly, mocked them at dinner. But privately, she watched her reflection and felt the solid ground beneath her carefully built future beginning to move. "What if the kingdom believes her?" she asked Varric one evening. He set down his cup, a small, deliberate movement. "Then we give them something else to believe." The whisper campaign began the next morning, not through official channels, where evidence was required, but through the informal networks that actually shaped court opinion. Elara had practiced forbidden magic. Elara had manipulated the throne. Elara carried cursed blood. The stories contradicted each other, which was entirely intentional. Consistency wasn't the goal. Doubt was. And doubt, once planted in a court that already wanted permission to dismiss something frightening, spread with remarkable efficiency. Meanwhile, deep in the archives, Elder Rowan had stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. Dust coated his robes. Ink stained his fingers. Stacks of recovered records covered every surface of the chamber. And the picture emerging from all of it was becoming impossible to look at directly. The kingdom had always believed it possessed one royal bloodline. It had possessed 2. One ruled. One protected. Not the kingdom, the throne itself. The ancient throne. The one that had remained silent for 2 centuries. The throne everyone believed belonged to the ruling family because everyone had been told to believe that, and the documents proving otherwise had been very carefully removed. According to the oldest surviving texts, hidden behind collapsed shelving, survived by pure accident, the protector bloodline had served as wardens. Chosen guardians. The throne answered only to them. Only through them could the ancient magic embedded in the Black Moonstone be fully engaged. For centuries both bloodlines existed alongside each other. Then the protectors vanished. Not vanished. Were erased. Rowan traced the evidence forward through time. Missing pages, destroyed ledgers, altered genealogies, burned census records, royal decrees referencing documents that no longer existed. Different kings. Different councils. Different generations. Same target. Same method. Same result. Someone had spent centuries maintaining the silence. And somewhere in that silence, one thread had survived. Hidden. Nameless. Growing up in palace kitchens with no family and no explanation. On the night Rowan translated the final fragment, he sat for a long time in the quiet of his lamplit chamber before moving at all. Then he carefully rolled the documents together, wrapped them in oilcloth, and placed them somewhere no one would think to look. Because if he was right, the people who had maintained this conspiracy for generations were still present, still powerful, and already watching. The arrest warrant was signed before Elara knew it existed. She was returning from the market district in the afternoon, carrying medical supplies for one of the palace healers. The city felt ordinary. Children played near the fountain. Merchants called from their stalls. The air smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. She walked with her hood loose and her mind elsewhere, turning over questions she had no answers to, when the crowd in front of her simply stopped, then parted. 8 royal guards in full armor moved through the gap toward her. The lead guard unrolled a scroll. His voice carried across the suddenly silent square. "Elara, you are charged with acts of treason against the crown." The medical supplies slipped from her arms. Glass shattered against the cobblestones. Red and amber liquid spread across the stones like a small, quiet disaster. She looked at the faces in the crowd surrounding her. Some held fear. Some held guilt. Many held something that looked disturbingly like shame. The shame of people who know they owe something to someone and cannot bring themselves to pay it. She had helped these people. She had saved children from a burning village. She had stayed when soldiers hadn't arrived yet, and fear was the only thing between survival and chaos. And now she stood in chains while the city watched in silence, and not one person stepped forward. Fear was always stronger than gratitude. She had known that. She had just never had to feel it so specifically. The iron restraints closed around her wrists. Cold. Heavy. The most honest thing that had happened to her all year. The guards began leading her toward the palace. Then the sky darkened. Not gradually. Not like weather. All at once, as though someone had covered the sun with a hand. The temperature dropped. The wind reversed direction. Every wolf in the capital lifted its head simultaneously. Every one, from palace hounds to city strays. And a vibration moved through the cobblestones beneath everyone's feet. Low, ancient, unignorable. The chains around Elara's wrists began to glow. A gasp swept outward through the crowd. The guards froze. Then, one by one, they released their hold on her. Not because they decided to, but because none of them wanted to be the one holding her arm when whatever was happening finished happening. The palace doors burst open. From somewhere deep inside the royal complex, the ancient throne erupted. Silver light shot upward through the palace roof in a column visible across the entire capital. Every bell in the city began ringing simultaneously, not from any human hand, as the ground trembled with a force that had nothing to do with earthquakes. The crowd fell to its knees, and Elara stood at the center of it all with the light reflecting in her wide, horrified eyes, understanding that this time the throne was not simply reacting. It was calling, and it had run out of patience. Bring her inside. King Darius descended the palace steps himself. His cloak moved behind him. His expression gave nothing away, which meant everything was moving beneath it. He reached Elara in the chaos of kneeling guards and stunned onlookers, and he removed the restraints from her wrists personally. The chains hit the stone with a sharp metallic crack that rang out over the bells. The crowd stared. Kings did not free prisoners. Not personally. Not in public. Darius looked at her. In the silver column of light, both of them looked lit from within. I think it's time we discover the truth. No one argued. Nobody even breathed. Hours later, in the oldest archive chamber beneath the palace, a room so ancient the palace itself had been built around it, Elder Rowan spread his recovered documents across a stone table. The smell of old parchment filled the air. Dust moved through the lantern light like suspended history. Elara stood nearby, still wearing the bruises at her wrists, still in her servant's dress. Darius stood across from Rowan with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. The kingdom has lived under a lie, Rowan said. Nobody spoke. The ancient throne was not designed for kings. The old man's voice trembled but held. It was designed to choose a guardian. The original kingdom possessed two royal bloodlines. One governed, one protected. Specifically, they protected the throne itself. The throne answered only to the guardian line. The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. And for centuries, Rowan continued, the throne tolerated the ruling family in the absence of the guardians. He paused. Let that settle. There is a difference between toleration and acceptance. The throne knew the difference, even when the kingdom forgot it. Darius was very still. All his life he had believed the throne was his birthright, his inheritance, the physical symbol of his authority. Now he stood in an underground chamber and understood that what he had believed was a generous interpretation of a more complicated truth. Rowan lifted the final document, a genealogy that someone had tried to destroy thoroughly enough that its survival was almost miraculous. Half the names scratched away, entire generations removed, the family tree reduced to a few surviving threads. But one thread remained. One line, one name in the margin, in handwriting different from the rest, written smaller and with more care, as though someone had been trying to preserve it without being obvious about it. The old archivist turned the document toward Elara. His voice cracked on the single word. You. Elara stared at it, then looked at him, then shook her head, the automatic, reflexive denial of someone receiving news too large to absorb at normal speed. No. You are the final descendant of the guardian bloodline. No. The word came harder this time. I am nobody. I have been nobody since the day I was left in. You were made nobody, Rowan said gently. There is a difference. The room broke apart into noise. Darius's guards argued with his council representative. The old priest near the door prayed aloud in a language Elara didn't recognize. Rowan spoke over the chaos in a steady voice, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The forged genealogies, the destroyed records, the systematic removal of every reference to the guardian line across generations of deliberate, coordinated erasure. Then came the last revelation, the one that broke something in Elara that the rest had merely bent. A witness account. One testimony, preserved by accident in the wrong archive box by someone who had failed to check it before dying. A description of what had actually happened to the guardian bloodline. Not disappearance. Not peaceful decline. Not the natural fading of an old institution. Hunting. Murder. Systematic elimination across generations. Children taken from records before anyone could notice the pattern. An entire lineage destroyed so completely that even the people doing the destroying could eventually convince themselves it had never existed. Elara listened. At first she did not understand. Then she did. She had believed her entire life that she was alone because no one had wanted her. Now she understood she was alone because someone had worked very hard to make her that way. The family she had never known, the names she had never learned, the voices she had never heard. They had not simply failed to find her. They had been taken. A single tear moved down her cheek. Nobody in the chamber made a sound. Even Darius, who had not shown vulnerability in a very long time, looked away, because some grief deserved the dignity of silence. Then the archive doors exploded open and a bleeding messenger stumbled inside, and the silence ended. The eastern barracks had been seized. Lady Selira had taken control of the palace guard. Several council members had joined her. The palace was under attack. Darius rose slowly. His face had shifted into something harder and older, the war king from the stories, not the tired administrator from real life. He looked at Captain Roland, who had appeared behind the messenger. One word. Positions. Roland ran. And the civil war that Selira had been building toward since the night of the festival finally announced itself. War began with bells. One bell, then all of them, rolling across the capital before the sun had risen. Smoke stained the eastern sky black by dawn. Barricades appeared across the main roads. Overturned carts, broken stalls, palace shields dragged into cobblestones. Half the capital had changed hands before most people were awake enough to understand what was happening. Inside the palace, chaos moved like fire through dry paper. Servants carried whatever seemed important. Priests dragged sacred objects from chapels. Soldiers received contradictory orders from 3 sources. And in the eastern wing, Lady Selira Voss stood in a white gown, white silk, silver embroidery, a claiming color, and directed a rebellion with the calm precision of someone who had been planning it for longer than anyone had noticed. Beside her, Varric Thorn observed the collapse of the palace order with the expression of a man correcting an inconvenience rather than committing treason. Something passed across Selira's face when she looked toward the palace proper. Uncertainty, brief, and unwilling. And Varric saw it the way he always saw weakness. "Seal the western doors," she said. "No one enters the throne room before I do." In the archive chamber, Elara heard the first battle horn vibrate through the stone walls. She stood with her hands at her sides, listening. The bruises at her wrists had deepened overnight. The chaos above was audible even down here, running feet, distant shouting, the intermittent crash of something breaking. Darius appeared in the doorway after speaking briefly with Roland. His eyes found hers immediately. The western tunnels. No. The word surprised her as much as it surprised him. Darius's expression hardened into something that in another context might have been the beginning of an argument. "This is not the time for. It's calling me." She looked at the ceiling. At the throne room, she could feel somewhere above, the way you feel a fire through a wall. The throne. "It's been calling me since this started." Elder Rowan went still. Darius's jaw tightened. "Your mistress is fighting a war in your palace because of me," Elara said. "Selira is fighting a war because she wants what she was never going to be given. Because the throne chose me instead. Because she is afraid. So am I." The admission arrived quietly. She hadn't meant to say it. "My family was murdered for this throne. I don't even know their names. I don't know what my mother sounded like. I don't know if anyone held me before I was left in the kitchens. I have spent my entire life as nobody. And now people are dying for a truth that nobody wanted discovered. The chamber was very quiet. So tell me. She looked at him directly, not as a servant looks at a king, but as one person looks at another across a shared, difficult problem. Do I hide while people die to protect a secret I never chose to carry? Darius held her gaze for a long moment. He had no answer, which was, in its way, an answer. Outside, the palace shook. Selira had reached the throne room. The great doors had been sealed. They opened anyway, because traitors had taken the keys. Selira entered the ancient hall surrounded by rebel guards, a handful of council lords, and priests too frightened to offer resistance. The throne room looked almost ordinary. Same chandeliers, same banners, same marble that had been cleaned of wine and memory alike. But the air sat differently here. Heavier, as though the room itself was paying attention. At the far end, the ancient throne waited. Black moonstone, silver veins, carved wolves along the arms. Silent, as it had been silent for 2 centuries. As it had been silent for every king who had ever sat upon it believing they deserved to. Selira approached it wearing her white gown like a claim. She climbed the first step. The throne did nothing. She climbed the second. Still nothing. The silence in the room grew more pointed with each step, and the guards behind her began exchanging glances. Selira straightened her spine and faced the chamber. I am Lady Selira Voss, chosen consort of the Alpha King, defender of the crown. I claim authority in the name of order, in the name of blood. The throne remained dark. A priest near the altar shook his head, slowly. My lady, speak the right, Selira said. The throne will not answer false blood. The words landed in the room like a stone in still water, and the ripples that followed were visible on every face. Selira slapped him. The sound cracked through the hall. The old priest staggered. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. Then obedience will do what blood will not, she said, her perfect composure finally fracturing along every hidden fault line. She turned toward her guards. Bring me the servant. The western doors exploded open. Not from magic. From a shoulder behind an axe, and Darius's guards flooding through behind it. The king entered with his sword drawn, and his cloak torn and blood darkening one sleeve. Proof of what the hallways had looked like on the way here. Behind him came Roland, Rowan, and Elara. The room changed. Instantly. Completely. Every rebel guard who had been looking towards Selira's white gown and borrowed authority now looked at the king, and behind him at the woman in the plain servant's dress with bruises at her wrists and wine stains in her memory. Selira stared at Elara across the throne room. You should have stayed on the floor. The words arrived like the echo of every other time they had been delivered, in every room, in every version. Elara felt the marble beneath her palms. The cold wine. The laughter. For one unguarded second she was back there. Small, kneeling, absolutely certain of her own insignificance because the room had been so unanimous in confirming it. Then the throne pulsed. Once. Softly. Like a heartbeat. Selira heard it. Her face went still. Darius looked from the throne to Elara, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not just recognition of the political situation, not just the calculated realism of a king managing a crisis. Something quieter. He had watched her choose to come to this room. He had watched her refuse to hide, while others bled. He had watched her arrive wearing no crown and no armor, carrying nothing except the truth and whatever small fierce thing lived in her that refused to be entirely extinguished by years of being told it shouldn't. He lowered his sword. Then he walked past the rebels, past the kneeling priests, past Selira, and stopped in front of Elara. And in front of everyone, the rebel guards, the council lords, the loyal soldiers, the mistress in the white gown, the ancient throne that had waited 200 years for this moment. The Alpha King of Dravenhall lowered himself to one knee. The sound of his armor meeting the marble rang through the chamber like a bell. The room stopped breathing. Kings did not kneel. That was one of the reliable facts of the world they all lived in. Kings sat. Kings stood. Kings decided the direction everyone else faced. They did not lower themselves to a single knee before a servant with wine-stained memories and borrowed shoes. Darius bowed his head. The throne has rejected my line, he said. His voice carried to every corner of the room without effort. It has chosen yours. I acknowledge your claim. Selira made a sound that was not quite a word. She stumbled back a step as though the air in front of her had suddenly become solid. Every noble present understood what those words meant. The Alpha King had surrendered the foundation of his authority, not because he was defeated, not because he had no choice, but because the truth had become larger than his pride. And the room, which had spent years learning to read Darius Valen's smallest expressions, understood the difference. Elara looked down at him, at the top of his bowed head, at the king who had sat on a throne that had never entirely accepted him, ruling a kingdom built on a lie he had not known was a lie. She had every reason to leave him there, every reason to let the reversal stand as its own kind of justice. She reached out and placed one hand briefly on his shoulder. Then she walked past him. The throne erupted. Silver light surged across the floor like water finding its level. The carved wolves along the walls opened glowing eyes. Every symbol that had been carved into the black moonstone in a language no living person fully understood blazed simultaneously, and the force of it drove every soul in the room to their knees in a single, simultaneous movement that no one chose. Guards dropped their weapons. Nobles collapsed where they stood. Rebel soldiers lost their swords. Even those who fought against it, who pressed against the pressure with everything they had, found their bodies obeying something older and more patient than human will. Selira fell last. Hard. Her white gown pulled around her. The woman who had forced Elara to kneel and spilled wine now knelt on the same marble, and the reversal was so complete, so geometrically exact, that no one dared breathe. Elara walked toward her. Selira looked up. For the first time, without the armor of her station and her jewels and her calculated cruelty, she looked exactly as frightened as she was. Elara, she whispered. The name sounded small in her mouth. Please. Elara stopped in front of her. I didn't know, Selira said. The lie came automatically. She probably wasn't even aware she'd told it. You knew I was powerless, Elara said. Not angry, just precise. Selira's voice cracked. You don't understand what it is to fight for a place beside power. No. A pause. I understand what it is to be crushed beneath it. The room waited. The throne pulsed softly behind them. Everyone in the chamber was waiting for what came next, because what came next would tell them everything about the woman the ancient magic had chosen. Execution would be easy to understand. Rage would be easy to understand. Revenge, after everything, after the floor and the laughter and the chains and the years, revenge would be easy to understand and almost impossible to argue against. Elara wanted it. That was the true part that no official account would ever include. She stood above the woman who had humiliated her and felt the pull of it. Real, sharp, entirely human, and entirely justified. Then she looked past Selira, at the soldiers bleeding near the doorways, at the servants hiding behind the nearest pillars, at the frightened, exhausted faces of people who had not asked to be caught inside someone else's civil war and now needed to understand what kind of ruler had just been chosen. Revenge was easy. That was why it was dangerous. She turned to face the room. No one else dies for a throne today. The words moved through the chamber like something physical. Lady Selira Voss will stand trial before the kingdom. A murmur swept outward. Lord Varric Thorn will answer for treason, for murder, and for the erasure of the guardian bloodline. Varric's careful composure finally showed a crack. Just one. Just briefly, but real. Every noble who participated in this rebellion will be judged by law, not by my anger. The throne pulsed again, not violently, not with force, warmly, the way a fire responds when given air. Silver light wrapped around Elara's hands. It moved up her wrists. The bruises faded beneath it, the purple marks of iron restraints dissolving until the skin was clean. The room watched in silence. Because this was the moment everyone understood what the throne had actually been measuring. Blood had opened the door. 200 years of waiting had opened the door. But mercy, choosing justice over revenge when revenge was entirely within reach, had proved she deserved to walk through it. War rarely ended with a victory. Most wars ended with silence. After the shouting, after the blood, after the carefully maintained deceptions, there came a moment when the noise stopped and everyone was forced to look at what remained. That morning arrived before dawn. The throne room smelled of smoke and old stone. Broken banners hung from the walls. Weapons lay where frightened men had dropped them. The silver light of the ancient throne continued pulsing gently through the wreckage, washing the damage in something that looked almost like healing. The rebellion collapsed with the speed of things always more fragile than they appeared. The nobles who had supported Selira dissolved into competing claims of ignorance. Those who fled were collected by Roland's soldiers efficiently. By sunrise, the palace guard was reunified. By mid-morning, the capital understood what had happened. Lady Selira stood in iron chains in the place she had tried to claim. The transformation was so complete it seemed theatrical. Same woman, stripped of everything she had used as armor. The jewels, the silk, the proximity to power, the court that had stopped meeting her eyes the moment that proximity vanished. Betrayal, she was discovering, had a very short glamour. Elder Rowan presented every document personally. Forged genealogies, altered census records, assassination orders hidden beneath generations of administrative language. Evidence of a conspiracy so old it had stopped being a conspiracy and had simply become history, which was precisely why it had survived so long. When he finished reading, his voice cracked. Tears ran openly down his weathered face. Not from grief alone, from relief. For most of his life, he had served the historical record by preserving it. Now, for the first time, the record had survived long enough to matter. The king crossed the room and placed his hand on Rowan's shoulder. No speech, no ceremony, just one man acknowledging another across the gulf of what they had both just lived through. The old archivist smiled, and something in him went quiet that had been unsettled for a very long time. They did not call it a coronation. What the priests prepared instead was older. The awakening, recovered from texts Rowan had spent weeks translating, a ritual that predated the current palace by generations. The capital transformed around it. Roads filled with people who had not been summoned. Thousands gathered before the palace gates, more crowded the surrounding streets. Not because they were commanded to, but because they needed to see what kind of person the throne had chosen and whether that person would be different from everyone who had sat on it before. Elara paused at the entrance to the great hall. The same doorway she had walked through carrying wine pitchers and firewood, and the particular invisibility of useful people. The same hall where laughter had followed her humiliation. The same floor where she had pressed her stained palms against cold marble. For a moment, the memories returned with physical precision. The cold stone, the spreading wine, Selira's voice. Girls like you should be kissing floors, not looking at thrones. The wound still existed. It would always exist, but it no longer decided anything. Darius appeared beside her, not ahead, not behind, but beside. The distinction was deliberate and visible. Nervous? He asked. Terrified. For the first time in a long time, he laughed. Quietly. Genuinely. Good. The ones who are not afraid of power are usually the ones who should never be given it. Elara held that for a moment, then walked forward. The throne recognized her before she reached the second step. Silver light began moving along its surface, gently at first, then brighter still, like a lamp turned up slowly by careful hands. The carved wolves along the arms opened their stone eyes. The forgotten symbols circling the base blazed in sequence. The force of it moved through the hall as warmth rather than pressure, as welcome rather than command. Every witness fell silent. Even the priests who had spent their lives preparing for moments exactly like this one. Elara climbed. 1 step. 2. 3. No resistance. No hesitation from the stone. No sense of anything requiring her to prove herself beyond the simple fact of her presence. The throne had been waiting. It was done waiting. When she sat, the palace shook. Not violently, not with the force of something breaking, but with the deep, resonant trembling of something that had been holding itself still for 200 years finally allowed to breathe. Silver light surrounded her completely. It moved over her hands, her shoulders, her uncrowded head. The symbols did not form a crown. The throne did not work that way, had never worked that way. It formed recognition, the oldest form of it, the kind that required nothing except presence and truth. The hall erupted. Cheers, tears, applause, everything breaking loose at once after hours of held breath and held fear and held history. Elara barely heard it. She sat in the glow of 2 centuries of waiting and understood something with the specific clarity of things understood at exactly the right moment. The throne had not chosen her because she had the right blood. Blood had opened the door. But mercy, and the refusal to become what had been done to her, that had proved she deserved to walk through it. Across the hall, Darius watched quietly. No bitterness on his face. No jealousy. Something simpler and more honest than either. The expression of a man who had spent years on a throne that merely tolerated him and had just watched someone take that same seat and be answered. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. Months later, the kingdom was still healing. Corrupt council members stood trial. Missing records were restored. Memorials rose for families whose names had been removed from history. Children began learning a version of the past that was simply true, which was harder than the version that came before and considerably more useful. Elder Rowan oversaw the restoration personally. His final years became the most satisfying of his life. Every morning in the archive chambers with a lamp and the quiet contentment of someone who spent their life protecting something and finally watched it survive. Selira disappeared into obscurity. Not forgotten. History rarely forgot people like her, but remembered differently. Not as a queen, as a lesson. Varric Thorn spent the remainder of his days answering for a conspiracy that had outlasted its architects, and when he was gone, it died with him. Then one afternoon, something small happened. The kind of thing history books never record. The kind that mattered anyway. A young servant, perhaps 14, thin, learning the particular art of invisibility, carried a silver tray through the great hall. The tray tilted. A goblet fell. Red wine spread across the white marble in a slow, familiar stain. The hall went quiet. Music stopped. Every noble present turned toward the sound, and for one collective second, everyone remembered the same night at once. The girl dropped to her knees. Her voice barely carried. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Another hand reached down before she could touch the spill. Gentle, steady, unhurried. The girl looked up. Queen Elara smiled. Not the careful smile of ceremony, but the real one. The one that knew exactly what it felt like to kneel on cold marble while a room full of people decided your worth. She helped the girl to her feet and brushed the dust from her sleeve with the matter-of-fact care of someone performing an entirely ordinary act of decency. "No one kneels here," Elara said, "because they were born beneath someone else." The words settled over the hall. Soft, simple, permanent. The kind that changed rooms without raising their voice. The young servant stared, unable to speak. Elara turned back toward the throne. The ancient throne burned softly behind her, not waiting anymore, not searching, not pulsing with the urgency of 2 centuries of unclaimed purpose. Simply burning, steadily, the way a fire burns when it has finally found the right hearth. The servant girl was gone. The queen remained. And for the first time in 200 years, the throne was exactly where it had always been waiting to be.